Sarah Jensen inherited her grandmother's old farmhouse a month after the funeral. The two-story home sat alone at the edge of sprawling fields, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was the kind of place where silence felt heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hum of the wind. Her grandmother had been obsessed with mirrors. They were everywhere, tall, gilded ones leaning against walls, small round ones on dressers, even handheld mirrors left in random spots, like forgotten relics. Sarah never understood why. But in the endless rain that had battered the farmhouse since her arrival, those mirrors seemed almost alive, reflecting flashes of lightning and distorted shadows that played tricks on her mind. By the third night, the storm had grown worse. Sheets of rain pounded the roof, and thunder rolled through the dark like something growling in the distance. Sarah was brushing her teeth in the upstairs bathroom, the mirror fogged from the damp chill that had crept inside. The hallway light was off behind her, and in the small mirror above the sink, the shadows in the doorway seemed darker than they should have been. She leaned forward to rinse, and when she looked up, she froze. Her reflection didn't move. It was just a second, a blink, but it stayed frozen longer than it should have. Her chest tightened. She leaned in closer, searching her own face, her damp hair clinging to her skin. "Just tired," she whispered to herself, the words sounding shaky. She flicked off the light and stepped into the hallway. The rain hammered the windows as if trying to break inside. The next morning, the storm didn't let up. It only grew worse. The farmhouse groaned in protest against the wind as Sarah moved through the halls, avoiding every mirror. The shadows that flickered in the glass the night before lingered in her memory. She threw old blankets over as many mirrors as she could find. The house felt heavier somehow, and every tap of rain against the windows sounded like faint knocking. By nightfall, she sat curled on the living room couch, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain on the roof. A tall mirror her grandmother had loved sat against the far wall. Sarah had planned to cover it earlier, but hadn't gotten around to it. She was typing on her laptop when something flickered in her peripheral vision. She looked up. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't right. The figure in the glass slouched slightly, its head tilted too far to one side. Then it smiled. It wasn't her smile. The smile stretched too wide, slow and deliberate, filled with something cold and cruel. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, the sound sharp against the quiet house. She stared at the mirror, her pulse pounding in her ears. The reflection was normal again. Outside, the rain beat against the windows like fingernails on glass. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The storm was relentless, the occasional flash of lightning spilling silver light across her room. Then she heard it, a soft tap, tap, tap. Sarah sat up slowly. The sound came again, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from downstairs. She grabbed her phone and crept to the top of the stairs, listening. The knocking grew louder. She descended the steps, her socks silent against the wood. The air felt colder the closer she got. She reached the living room, her eyes falling on the tall mirror. The blanket she'd meant to cover it with lay crumpled on the floor. The mirror was uncovered. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. A message from an unknown number. "You forgot one." Her breath hitched. Slowly she looked back at the mirror. Her reflection was gone. The glass was empty. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, something moved on the other side of the glass. Sarah stumbled backward. The knocking started again, this time louder and faster, as if fists were pounding on every window in the house. Tap, tap, tap. The kitchen window rattled. The hallway mirror groaned in its frame. Sarah bolted upstairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her. The knocking followed, coming from the walls, the windows, and finally the mirror in her room. Tap, tap, tap. She stared at it, heart racing, as cracks began to spiderweb across the glass. Her reflection appeared again, but now it was grinning, teeth too sharp and eyes as black as the storm outside. "Let me in," it whispered, though her lips didn't move. The glass shattered, and everything went dark. Days later, when the police arrived, the farmhouse was silent, except for the steady patter of rain. Every window was broken, every mirror shattered into shards that littered the floors like glass teeth. They never found Sarah, but some officers swore they saw her face reflected in the largest shard left in the bedroom, smiling. "1998. Ethan knew the road through Black Hollow Forest was dangerous, but it was the fastest way home. His shift at the diner had run late again, and with rain pouring harder than he'd ever seen, the highway was already closed. Black Hollow was the only option. The forest road was narrow, curving sharply with no streetlights to guide the way. The rain pounded the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter, squinting at the thin, watery beams of his headlights slicing into the darkness. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches like twisted fingers reaching into the road. About halfway through the woods, something caught his eye, a flash of red, 2 tiny dots glowing far off in the trees. He blinked and looked again, but the light was gone. Probably an animal, he thought. A deer or fox reflecting the light. He kept driving. 5 minutes later, he saw them again. The same red dots, closer this time, and unmoving. They weren't eyes reflecting light. They were glowing. Ethan's stomach churned. He glanced at his rear-view mirror, but the road behind him was swallowed by rain and darkness. Then he saw them again. This time, they were right at the edge of the road, just outside the reach of his headlights. 2 glowing red points, unblinking, watching him. Ethan's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. "Just the rain playing tricks," he muttered. But when he looked again, the eyes were gone. Up ahead, a figure appeared on the road. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The car lurched to a stop, headlights flooding the figure in pale yellow light. A woman stood there. She was barefoot, soaking wet, her long hair plastered to her face. Her clothes were torn, and she stood perfectly still, arms hanging limply at her sides. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He rolled the window down just an inch. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't move. "Do you need help?" Her head twitched slightly, turning toward him. Then she smiled. It wasn't a human smile, too wide, the edges of her mouth splitting as if the skin couldn't stretch that far. Ethan's foot shot to the gas pedal. He swerved around her, tires spinning, the engine roaring. When he looked in the rearview mirror, she was gone. He drove faster now, his heart racing. The rain had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just water hitting the roof. It was a constant whisper, a pattern, like voices murmuring to one another. Then the red eyes appeared again. This time, they were in the middle of the road. Ethan's grip on the wheel turned his knuckles white. He swerved, barely missing whatever it was. The car skidded sideways before he corrected it, the tail end fishtailing on the slick pavement. He didn't stop to look, but he heard something, a faint thump, like something had landed on the roof of his car. "Jesus," he whispered, eyes darting upward. The rain drowned out everything, pounding harder now. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew heavier, like footsteps pacing above him. Ethan's breath hitched. He pushed the pedal to the floor, the car speeding dangerously down the winding road. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a long, slow scratch moved across the roof. He screamed and kept driving, refusing to look back. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ethan saw the glow of a gas station sign up ahead. The forest thinned, and he pulled into the empty lot, parking under the flickering light. His chest heaved as he sat there, rain streaming down the windows. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to calm his breathing. And then he saw it. In the back seat, two glowing red eyes staring at him through the mirror. Before he could scream, the thing smiled. The next morning, they found Ethan's car abandoned at the gas station. The driver's seat was empty, the doors locked. The only clue was a set of muddy footprints leading from the back seat to the nearby forest, disappearing into the rain-soaked ground. And some say, on nights when the rain is heavy, if you drive through Black Hollow, you'll see two glowing red eyes watching you from the trees, waiting. In the fall of 1954, the bridge over Coldwater Creek became a shortcut for travelers heading between small towns in rural Tennessee. It was nothing more than a crumbling two-lane bridge, its wooden planks slick from decades of rain and neglect. Locals avoided it when they could. There were whispers, old stories about the bridge, but none of them were clear. Some said it was haunted. Others warned of the ferrymen who waited there when the rain fell hardest. For Clarence Holt, it was just another bridge. Clarence was a delivery driver, working long shifts to keep his family afloat. That October had brought weeks of rain. It pounded the farmland and forests relentlessly, leaving rivers bloated and roads swallowed by mud. On the night of October 14th, Clarence's boss had sent him on a late run to the next town over. "Take the bridge over Coldwater," his boss said, handing him the keys. "It'll save you 20 miles. Clarence hesitated. "Ain't it washed out?" His boss shook his head. "Town patched it up weeks ago. Just don't drive too fast." Clarence shrugged. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and the idea of saving 20 miles on a rainy night appealed to him. He climbed into his delivery truck and hit the road just as the sky darkened completely. By the time he reached Coldwater Creek, the rain had turned into a downpour. It hammered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The headlights were weak against the curtain of water, barely cutting through the haze as the forest closed in around him. Clarence turned onto the old dirt road that led to the bridge. The truck rumbled through puddles and grooves in the mud, the tires fighting for traction. As he approached the bridge, he saw it through the rain, a narrow span of wood and rusted metal stretching across the swollen creek below. The water churned violently beneath it, frothing gray and white, like something alive. Clarence drove slowly onto the bridge, the wooden planks creaking beneath the weight of the truck. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Halfway across, the truck's headlights flickered. Then the engine sputtered. Clarence muttered a curse, shifting the truck into neutral and trying the ignition again. The truck groaned, but the engine refused to turn over. Rain pounded harder, as if mocking him. "Come on, you piece of junk," he grumbled, twisting the key again and again. The headlights dimmed further, and Clarence felt the truck settle unnaturally into place. as though the bridge itself were sinking under him. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. The rain distorted everything outside the windshield, making the world look warped and liquid. And then he saw something move. At first it was just a shadow near the edge of the bridge, a vague figure walking slowly toward him through the rain. Clarence squinted, wiping condensation from the inside of the glass. Someone was on the bridge. The figure stepped closer, and the truck's remaining light caught it. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old, wide-brimmed hat that shielded his face from view. His clothes were ragged, soaked through by the rain. In one hand, he held a lantern. It flickered weakly, casting just enough light to show his silhouette and the faint glint of water dripping from the brim of his hat. Clarence rolled the window down an inch. "Hey, you need something?" The figure didn't answer. It stopped about 10 feet away, standing perfectly still, the lantern swaying slightly in its hand. Clarence's heart pounded. He felt suddenly exposed, like a rabbit under the eyes of a hawk. "You hear me, old man?" Clarence called louder. "I ain't got all night." The figure tilted its head slowly, as though considering him. Then Clarence noticed something. The rain wasn't falling on the man. It fell around him, splattering the wood, bouncing off the truck, but it never touched him. The air around him seemed empty, hollow. Clarence's chest tightened. The man lifted the lantern higher, and for the first time, Clarence saw his face. It was bone white. The skin stretched impossibly tight over his skull. His eyes were black pits, bottomless voids that seemed to pull Clarence into them. The man smiled, and Clarence swore he saw teeth. Far too many teeth. Clarence lunged for the ignition, desperate to get the truck started. He didn't care if he flooded the engine. He just had to get away. But the key wouldn't turn. It was stuck. Outside, the man stepped closer. Clarence scrambled for the door handle, but the truck's locks wouldn't budge. He slammed his fist against the window, screaming for help, though he knew no one would hear him. The man stopped just outside the driver's window. Clarence stared, paralyzed. The figure leaned closer, so close that Clarence could see the thin skin on his face ripple, like there was something moving beneath it. The lantern flared brighter, and then the man whisped. In December 1977, the rain came with a vengeance, sweeping across the small Oregon town of Elkwood. Roads turned to rivers, and the dense pine forests surrounding the town grew darker and more menacing with every passing day. Emily Carter, a 27-year-old wildlife researcher, didn't mind the isolation. She'd come to Elkwood to document the region's dwindling wolf population, and her cabin, set deep in the woods, was perfect for the job. By her third week there, the rain hadn't let up once. It drummed endlessly on the roof and windows, a constant backdrop to her work. The evenings were eerily quiet, except for the rain. It wasn't until December 15th that Emily started to notice things. It began with footprints. That morning, as she stepped out to grab firewood, she spotted them in the muddy ground just outside her porch. They weren't hers. Too large, too deep. The prints stretched from the tree line, circling the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. Emily crouched to examine them. They didn't look like boots or shoes. Bare feet, large ones. Her skin prickled. She grabbed her camera, snapping a few photos before retreating inside. Wolves didn't leave tracks like that. She brushed it off as a trespasser, or someone lost in the storm. People did strange things out here. That night, as she worked by the dim glow of her desk lamp, Emily caught movement outside her window. Just a flicker, like a shadow slipping between the trees. She froze, her breath clouding the cold air inside the cabin. The rain blurred everything beyond the glass. Emily stood, her chair scraping against the wood, and stepped toward the window. She pressed her face to the cold pane, squinting. Nothing. Just the relentless downpour and the swaying silhouettes of trees. She shook her head and turned back to her desk. Her radio hissed with static, the old machine struggling against the storm. She flipped it off, and the silence in the cabin felt thicker than before. Then she noticed it. The sound. It wasn't rain, not entirely. There was something underneath it, faint but rhythmic. A low, guttural hum. Emily's stomach tightened. She strained her ears, her pulse thundering as the sound grew louder. It was coming from outside. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously opened the door. Rain poured in heavy sheets, drenching her instantly. She swept the beam across the porch and the edge of the woods, searching for the source of the sound. Then she saw it. At the edge of the tree line stood a figure. It was impossibly tall, its shape barely visible through the curtain of rain. The flashlight flickered as she aimed it toward the figure, and the light seemed to bend, refusing to touch it. "Hey!" Emily's voice cracked. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Emily's heart pounded as the low hum grew louder, vibrating in her chest. She backed into the cabin, slamming the door and locking it. The hum didn't stop. It stayed with her all night, ebbing and flowing like something circling the cabin. Emily barely slept, clutching a knife as she lay under the covers, jumping at every creak and groan of the wood. By morning, the hum was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain. But when she opened the door to check for tracks, her blood ran cold. The footprints were back, larger this time. They circled the cabin over and over again, pressed deep into the mud, as if whatever it was had spent the entire night pacing. Emily snapped more photos, her hands trembling. She couldn't stay here. She packed quickly, shoving her belongings into a duffel bag, and started her truck. The engine sputtered. "Come on," she muttered, twisting the key again. The truck roared to life, but when she looked up, she saw something standing in the middle of the road. The figure. It was closer now, and she could see its face, or lack of one. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over a long, angular skull. Its eyes were pits of shadow, its mouth a thin, jagged slit that seemed to twitch with some internal, terrible laughter. Emily screamed, slamming the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching as she swerved off the road and into the forest. The truck finally died halfway through the woods. The rain had turned into a torrent, hammering the roof so hard it felt like it would cave in. Emily sat trembling, gripping the wheel, staring into the rearview mirror. Behind her, she saw movement. Branches snapping, trees swaying. And then the figure stepped into the headlights. It moved impossibly fast. One moment at the edge of the forest, the next just feet from her door. The low hum returned, deafening now, vibrating through her bones. Emily covered her ears, screaming as the figure reached for the truck, its impossibly long fingers curling around the door handle. The last thing she saw was its face, pressing against the glass, its mouth splitting open into an endless void of teeth. Emily's truck was found 3 days later, submerged in a nearby creek. The engine was ripped apart, the doors torn off their hinges. Her camera was recovered from the wreckage. The last photo showed the forest, blurry from rain, except for one clear figure in the center of the frame, watching, waiting. In the summer of 2017, a relentless rainstorm swept over the Pacific Northwest, stretching into weeks without a single break. Roads turned into rivers, cell service faltered, and entire towns seemed swallowed by the mist that hung like a veil over the trees. It was the kind of rain that drowned out thoughts, filling every waking moment with its endless drumming. For Emma Nichols, a 32-year-old freelance editor, the storm was more of an annoyance than a real problem. She had recently moved to a rented cabin deep in the woods outside of Seattle, seeking solitude after her divorce. The cabin was isolated, the nearest neighbor over a mile away, and though the rain made it feel colder than it should have been in late summer, she found the solitude comforting. At least she did until the third week. It started subtly. Emma first noticed that her phone calls seemed to drop more frequently. She chalked it up to the storm. Then her emails stopped sending, and soon her only reliable source of connection to the outside world was a weathered analog radio she'd found in a closet. The static-laden voice of a weatherman became her constant companion, his updates as monotonous as the rain itself. But then, strange things began to happen. The first was the voice. She'd been lying in bed late one night, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, the rain a constant percussion against the windows. Her radio buzzed faintly on the bedside table, and just as she began to drift off, she heard it, a low murmur threading through the static. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the weatherman's voice. It was softer, colder, and speaking directly to her. Emma, it whispered, her name distorted, stretched. She froze, staring at the radio as it hissed into silence. Her mind raced, rationalizing the voice as nothing more than her exhaustion playing tricks. The next day, the footprints appeared. Muddy impressions, too large to be hers, tracked across her porch and down the steps into the yard. She tried to convince herself it was from a lost hiker, though the thought unsettled her. The tracks seemed to lead straight to her window, stopping there as though someone had stood silently, looking inside. She locked the door that evening, drawing the curtains tight. But that night, the radio voice returned, clearer this time, cutting through the storm like a scalpel. "Why do you hide?" it asked. Emma sat paralyzed, her eyes locked on the faint green glow of the dial. "You can't hide forever." Her hands trembled as she yanked the radio's cord from the wall. The silence that followed was worse. The days blurred into one another, the rain growing heavier, the storm darker. The power flickered intermittently, forcing her to rely on candles and flashlights that cast long, flickering shadows. And the voices didn't stop. Even unplugged, the radio would hum to life at odd hours, whispering fragmented sentences that chilled her to the bone. "It's waiting, out there, watching." Emma stopped sleeping, her nerves frayed, her every sense tuned to the creaks and groans of the old cabin. Then one night, she woke to the sound of running water. Groggy, she stumbled to the bathroom, expecting a leaky faucet. But the sink was dry. The sound wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, just beneath her bedroom window. She peeked through the curtains, her breath fogging the glass. A figure stood in the downpour, its face obscured by the rain, its shape barely more than a shadow. It didn't move, but its presence radiated something primal and wrong. Emma's heart pounded as she backed away, fumbling for her phone, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times she pressed the button. The following day, she ventured outside during a brief lull in the storm. She searched for any sign of the figure but found nothing except her own muddy footprints from the porch. She forced herself to believe it had been her imagination, a trick of light and exhaustion. But then she noticed something strange. The woods around the cabin, normally alive with the sounds of birds and insects, were silent. No animals, no movement, just the sound of water dripping from leaves. She walked further, her boots sinking into the sodden ground until she saw it. A small circle of stones, unnaturally arranged, sat at the base of a tree. At the center of the circle was her name, crudely etched into a flat, jagged rock. She ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind her, her chest heaving with panic. That night, the figure came closer. She saw it again through the kitchen window, its outline more defined now. It wore no clothing, its body thin and pale, and its head tilted unnaturally as it stared back at her. She could feel its gaze even through the glass, a weight that pressed against her chest and froze her in place. And then it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too long. She screamed, grabbing a knife from the counter, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. The next day, the rain turned torrential, and the cabin's roof began to leak. Buckets and pans dotted the floor, catching water as Emma paced, her nerves unraveling completely. She tried to leave, throwing on a raincoat and heading for her car, but the engine wouldn't start. She slammed her fists on the steering wheel, sobbing as the rain streamed down the windshield, and when she looked up, it was there again. Standing at the edge of the driveway, its hollow black eyes fixed on her. She spent the rest of the day locked inside, every light in the cabin on, the knife clutched in her hand. By the time night fell, the lights began to flicker. The storm grew deafening, the wind howling like a chorus of screams. And then, the power went out completely. Darkness swallowed the cabin, and Emma's flashlight barely penetrated the oppressive black. She huddled in a corner, her back against the wall, as the radio crackled to life once more. "It's here," the voice hissed, followed by a low, guttural laugh. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate. The front door creaked open, though she had locked it. Her flashlight beam trembled as she aimed it toward the hall, but it only illuminated empty space. And then the footsteps stopped, replaced by breathing. Heavy, wet breathing just behind her. When the authorities found the cabin weeks later, the storm had passed, leaving the woods eerily calm. The inside was in disarray, overturned furniture, muddy footprints leading from room to room, but there was no sign of Emma. Her phone was found in the yard, its screen cracked and waterlogged, and on the kitchen table was a jagged stone with her name carved into it, the edges still damp. Locals say the rainstorm never truly left the area. When the wind howls and the rain falls heavy, some claim to hear her voice, whispering for help, lost in the endless storm. It was a cold December night in 2019, and Claire Hastings, a 21-year-old college junior, was huddled in the library's dimly lit study hall. Finals were only a week away, and the stress of organic chemistry had driven her to seek the library's late-night quiet. The campus library, a towering brick building with arched windows and creaking floors, stayed open until 3 a.m. during exam season. By midnight, it was almost deserted. Claire sat in a corner cubicle, the yellowish overhead light casting shadows on the aging wooden desks. Her laptop glowed faintly as she typed notes into a study guide, occasionally glancing up at the massive clock on the wall. The rain outside was steady, drumming against the tall windows and creating an eerie soundtrack for her solitude. She glanced around the hall, noticing that the once busy room had emptied out, except for a single student sitting a few rows away. His back was to her, his head bowed over an open book. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her typing and the occasional scrape of a chair. Claire adjusted her headphones, realizing she'd been sitting too long. Stretching, she decided to grab another coffee from the vending machine just outside the study hall. As she stood, her eyes flicked to the other student. He hadn't moved in over an hour. His rigid posture and unnaturally still presence sent a chill down her spine. But she told herself he was probably just deep in focus. The hallway outside the study hall was dimly lit, the buzzing fluorescent bulbs giving everything a sickly yellow hue. Claire fed $1 into the vending machine, waiting for the familiar clunk of her coffee cup. The rain outside grew louder, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. As she bent to grab the cup, a noise made her pause. It wasn't the rain. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic hum, like someone whispering far away. Claire's pulse quickened. She turned toward the study hall, expecting to see someone coming out, but the doorway was empty. Shrugging it off, she returned to her cubicle, sipping her coffee to shake off the unease. The other student was still there, in the exact same position, his head tilted slightly forward. She sat back down and focused on her laptop, but the hum returned, louder this time. It was a wet, guttural sound, and it wasn't coming from her headphones. She turned again, and her heart sank. The student was gone. His chair was pushed back, the book still open on the desk. She hadn't heard him leave. Feeling a strange pull of dread, she approached his desk. The book was ancient, its leather cover cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The text was in a language she didn't recognize, sharp, angular characters that seemed to shift when she stared at them too long. The hum grew louder, as if the book itself was vibrating with the sound. A sudden bang broke her trance. Claire jumped, spinning toward the noise. It came from the far corner of the room, where a stack of books had toppled from a shelf. Her breath hitched as she scanned the room, now dark, except for her laptop and the single lamp over the other desk. She called out, her voice trembling. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The hum became a growl, a deep guttural sound that vibrated through her chest. She backed away from the desk, her eyes darting toward the exit, but her path was blocked. The student was standing in the doorway, only it wasn't him anymore. His face was pale, his eyes black pits that seemed to pull her in. His mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, his teeth jagged and wet. He stepped forward, his body moving unnaturally, jerking like a marionette. Claire screamed and ran toward the far side of the hall, her footsteps echoing as the lights flickered overhead. The growl followed her, growing louder, closer. She darted into a narrow row of shelves, pressing herself against the cold metal as she tried to quiet her ragged breathing. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, filled the hall. Claire. The voice was wet, guttural, and impossibly close. She clamped her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She didn't dare move, but when she glanced to her left, she saw him again, standing at the end of the aisle. His head tilted too far to one side, his black eyes locked onto hers. He didn't move, but the shadows around him did, crawling and stretching toward her like living things. She bolted, knocking over a shelf as she sprinted for the exit. Her heart pounded as she threw open the door and stumbled into the rain-soaked courtyard outside. The library loomed behind her, its windows dark and foreboding. She didn't look back, running blindly across campus until she reached the safety of her dorm. The next day, the library was closed. Police tape cordoned off the entrance, and whispers of an investigation spread across campus. A librarian had been found dead in the study hall, his body contorted in ways that didn't make sense. Claire didn't tell anyone what she had seen, but that night, as she lay in bed, the hum returned. It was faint, coming from her laptop, which she hadn't opened since fleeing the library. When she powered it on, her screen displayed a single image, the book from the desk, its pages open to the shifting symbols, and in the reflection of the screen, she saw him. In November 2022, the rain swept over the city of Portland, drenching the streets and turning everything into a slick, reflective surface. Riley Hart, a 26-year-old marketing intern, was pulling yet another late night at the downtown high-rise office where she worked. It was nearly midnight, and the building was eerily silent except for the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator. The storm outside made the entire building feel hollow, the rain hammering against the vast glass walls of the lobby. Riley pressed the button for the elevator, watching as the numbers above the doors blinked slowly down from the 15th floor. She folded her arms, impatient, her mind drifting to the warmth of her apartment and the bottle of wine she'd planned to open as soon as she got home. The elevator arrived with a faint ding, and the doors slid open. She stepped inside, pressing the button for the garage. The doors began to close, but just before they did, a hand shot between them, triggering the sensor. The doors slid back open, and a man stepped in. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, with the collar turned up, his face obscured by the brim of a rain-soaked hat. "Going down?" Riley asked, trying to hide her unease. The man didn't respond. He stood silently in the corner, facing the wall. Riley's stomach tightened, but she told herself it was fine. People were strange sometimes. Maybe he just wanted to avoid conversation. The elevator began its descent, the hum of the machinery blending with the muffled sound of rain. She kept her eyes on the digital display as the numbers ticked down. 11, 10. The elevator jolted, the lights flickering. Riley's breath caught in her throat. The man didn't move. The light steadied, and the elevator continued downward. 9, 8. The hum grew louder, deeper, almost like a growl. Riley glanced at the man. He hadn't shifted an inch. His head was still bowed, his face obscured. She felt her pulse quicken as she took a small step back, pressing herself against the opposite wall. 7, 6. The elevator shuddered again, and the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Riley gasped, gripping the railing for balance. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing and the faint hum of the elevator's machinery. Then she heard it, a soft, wet whisper. Almost there. Her blood ran cold. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The lights flickered back on, and the man was now facing her. His face was pale, too pale, his eyes black and unblinking. His mouth stretched into a smile, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Riley screamed, slamming her hand against the emergency button. The elevator jerked to a halt, and the lights flickered violently, casting the man's twisted features in brief, strobe-like flashes. He stepped closer, his movements unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on invisible strings. "Almost there," he repeated, his voice overlapping with itself, as though two people were speaking at once. Riley pressed herself against the wall, her hands fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. The elevator shuddered, and the lights went out again. In the pitch black, she heard his breathing, ragged, wet, too close. The doors slid open. Riley bolted into the darkness, her shoes slipping on the wet floor. She wasn't in the garage. She wasn't even in the building. She was standing in a long, endless corridor, lined with flickering fluorescent lights. The air was damp and cold, the walls covered in something black and glistening. Behind her, the elevator doors slid shut with a metallic groan, trapping the man inside. Or so she thought. The whisper came again, this time from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't leave." The lights above her began to pop, one by one, plunging the corridor into darkness. Riley ran, her heart pounding, the sound of her footsteps echoing endlessly. The whispers followed her, growing louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. Ahead she saw a door, a single rusted door at the end of the corridor. She threw herself against it, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She turned, her back against the door, and saw him standing at the edge of the light. He was closer now, his smile impossibly wide, his arms stretching unnaturally as he reached for her. The last light went out. When the elevator was found the next morning, it was empty. The building's security footage showed Riley stepping inside, but there was no sign of anyone else. The footage ended abruptly as the elevator doors closed, replaced by static. Her co-workers said she must have left the city. The police listed her as missing, but the night guards at the building tell a different story. Sometimes when the storm is heavy, the elevator stops on random floors. The doors slide open to an empty hallway, and faint whispers echo through the air. They say if you listen closely, you can hear a voice. "Almost there." In March of 2003, Emily Carlson was a 19-year-old sophomore at Jefferson State College, a small campus known for its sprawling, Gothic-style architecture. The dorms were old, dating back to the early 1900s, with creaking wooden floors, dimly lit hallways, and the kind of draft that made even warm nights feel cold. She had moved into Linden Hall at the start of the semester, a building infamous for its maze-like layout and unreliable elevator. It was the kind of place where whispered rumors of hauntings traveled faster than Wi-Fi. Emily hadn't thought much of the stories. She was too busy juggling classes, late-night study sessions, and her part-time job at the campus bookstore. But one night in early spring, she found herself working on an essay in the dorm's basement study lounge. The rain outside was relentless, hammering against the narrow windows near the ceiling. Most of the dorm had gone quiet for the night, and she relished the solitude. As the hours dragged on, the hum of the fluorescent lights began to blend with the rain's rhythm. Emily was halfway through her third cup of instant coffee when she realized she'd forgotten her textbook upstairs. With a sigh, she pushed back her chair, grabbed her keycard, and headed for the stairwell. The building felt eerily still, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the narrow hallway. She reached the second floor and made her way toward her room when she noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, Where there should have been a wall was a door. She stopped, frowning. There was no door there earlier. She was certain of it. The door was old, its paint peeling, with no number or nameplate. It wasn't like the others in the dorm, which were uniform and plain. This door looked wrong. It was slightly ajar, a faint orange light spilling into the dark hallway. Curiosity pulled her closer. She peered inside, expecting to see a maintenance closet or storage space. Instead, she found a room. It was small and cluttered, filled with mismatched furniture that looked decades old. A heavy wooden desk sat in the corner, covered in dust, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple in the light. At the center of the room was a chair, facing a large, outdated TV set. The TV was on. The screen flickered with static, the faint hum crackling through the room. Emily hesitated, her breath hitching. The air was colder here, heavy, as though the room hadn't been opened in years. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged through her as she twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" The static grew louder, almost deafening, and she turned back toward the TV. The screen had changed. No longer just white noise, it now showed a hallway identical to the one she'd just walked down. Her heart pounded as she watched a shadow move across the screen, slow and deliberate. The camera, or whatever was filming, panned toward a door. Her door. Emily's knees went weak as the screen shifted again. The perspective changed, the image now showing the room she was in, from a corner she couldn't see. She stepped back, bumping into the desk. A metallic clatter echoed as something fell to the floor. She looked down and saw a key, rusted and heavy. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and rushed to the door. The key slid into the lock with a reluctant click, and the door swung open. The hallway was dark, the lights flickering weakly. She stumbled out, slamming the door behind her. Turning to make sure it stayed shut, she froze. The door was gone. The wall was smooth, as if it had never been there. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away, the sound of her footsteps echoing loudly. When she reached her room, she locked herself inside and didn't sleep. The next morning, she returned to the hallway. It was empty. She asked a maintenance worker about the strange door, but he just gave her a puzzled look. "There's no room like that here," he said, "and there's never been one." Emily moved out of Linden Hall 2 weeks later, but the memory of that night stayed with her. She kept the key, rusted and heavy, as proof that she hadn't imagined it. Years later, while visiting a friend who still lived on campus, she walked past Linden Hall. The building looked the same, its Gothic architecture looming under the evening sky. But as she glanced at the second-floor windows, she froze. In the dim light, she could see a faint orange glow from one of the rooms. And for just a moment, she swore she saw a figure sitting in front of a flickering TV, watching her. In the summer of 2006, a long stretch of highway in rural Nevada became the backdrop for one of the strangest nights of Lauren Davis's life. She was 24, on her way back to Los Angeles after a friend's wedding in Utah. The drive had been uneventful until dusk fell, and the radio lost its signal. Her phone was useless this far out, leaving her alone with the faint hum of her car engine and the occasional howl of the desert wind. The rain came out of nowhere, a sudden, relentless downpour that swallowed the road in darkness. Lauren squinted through the windshield, her wipers struggling against the torrent. Her gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and with no sign of civilization for miles, panic began to creep in. That's when she saw it, a diner, its neon sign glowing faintly in the storm. The sign flickered with the words, "Eat," and though the lights seemed worn and barely functional, they were a beacon of hope in the endless rain. Lauren pulled into the gravel parking lot, her tires crunching loudly. The place looked frozen in time, with its faded paint and 1950s-style decor. A lone car sat in the lot, an old sedan that looked as though it hadn't moved in years. She hesitated, but the rain was too heavy to stay outside. The door jingled as she stepped inside, and immediately the air felt wrong. The diner was silent, not the comforting silence of an empty room, but an oppressive, suffocating stillness that made her skin crawl. A row of booths lined the walls, each one occupied by figures sitting unnaturally still. No one looked up as she entered. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing slightly. "Is anyone working?" The figures didn't respond. She walked toward the counter, her boots squeaking on the tiled floor. Behind the counter stood a man in a cook's uniform, his back to her, as he faced the grill. His head was tilted slightly to one side, as though listening. "Excuse me," Lauren said, louder this time. "Do you have a phone I can use, or a gas station nearby?" The man didn't move. None of them did. The stillness was unbearable, and as she stepped closer, her stomach sank. The patrons in the booths weren't moving because they weren't alive. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy and unseeing. Their clothes were dated, their hairstyles decades out of place. They sat in perfect poses, as though waiting for meals that would never come. Lauren stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She turned toward the door, but it was gone. Where there had been a door leading to the parking lot, there was now only a blank wall. The cook finally moved, his head rotating slowly until his face was visible. His eyes were empty sockets, his grin impossibly wide, stretching beyond what should have been physically possible. "Welcome," he said in a voice that sounded like static. "We've been waiting for you." The lights flickered, and the patrons in the booths turned their heads toward her in unison. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, mingling with the sound of something wet dragging across the floor. Lauren turned to run, but collided with one of the patrons, a woman whose cold, stiff hands gripped her arm with inhuman strength. "You can't leave," the cook said, stepping around the counter. His grin never wavered, his hollow eyes fixed on her as the lights flickered again. Not yet. The walls seemed to close in, the booths stretching endlessly into the distance as the air grew heavier. Lauren screamed, pulling free from the woman's grip and stumbling into the back of the diner. She slammed through a swinging door into the kitchen, the stench of rot hitting her like a wave. The room was filled with meat hooks, each one holding something unrecognizable, but unmistakably human. A voice whispered in her ear, soft and cold. "Stay with us." She turned, but there was no one there. The room pulsed with shadows, the faint hum, now a deafening roar. She grabbed a rusted knife from a counter and swung blindly, slicing through the air as the shadows closed in. The walls seemed to dissolve, and the last thing she saw was the cook's grin, impossibly wide, as he whispered, "You're home now." Lauren's car was found abandoned on the highway 3 days later, its tank empty and its doors locked. The diner wasn't there. Locals claimed it had burned down decades ago, and no one could explain how she had found it. Some said the storm must have confused her, but truckers passing through on rainy nights tell a different story. They say when the rain is heavy and the road feels endless, you might see the faint glow of a neon sign in the distance. If you do, keep driving, because if you stop, you'll never leave.